Well, Sean, you wrote a letter there recently to the Marine Times complaining about giving your views on how you felt the eel fisheries were handled in Ireland over the years. Can you tell us a bit, why did you write that letter?
I suppose the culmination of complete frustration. The backdrop to this was there over 10 years ago on foot of an EU directive to cut eel mortality by 40% across the board. That's water extraction, agriculture, industry, and fishing being a small part of it.
What does eel mortality mean?
That means like casualties, basically eels that would be killed by fishing or eels that are killed by hydro dams and agricultural pollution, all that thing. So it was right across the board. So the only thing the Irish state done really in real terms was it banned the fishery by exactly 60%, which resulted in 100% of the loss of the fishery. Not only did it ban the fishery, it ordered the market closed, and it closed down Ireland's one and only eel smokery. This was right at the beginning of the recession. Closed it all down. And since then, we've been lobbying, we've lobbied every politician.
So the 60% reduction meant an effective 100% ban for fisheries.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the other percentages,
it just fitted the thing.
Yeah.
It just fitted the bill. If you go 60% beyond the EU thing, it closed it down. So, for the last 10 years, we've lobbied every politician. I've been to Brussels. When we went to Brussels, we were told it is not the EU decision to close it. It was the Irish interpretation of it. You come to Ireland, they tell you it's the EU directive, and it basically seems to be designed to frustrate people and get them to go away. I found being in Brussels a real eye-opener of how crazy the whole system appears to be, especially when you talk to Dutch fishermen and how they have scientists and fishery managements that are actually on their side. So for some of those nations, the EU actually works to a point. But for Ireland, I suppose the EU has been a complete disaster from the fishing communities. And more so for the agricultural, because the small and medium-sized farms are disappearing as well. But the eel fishery is very, very interesting. And I believe there should be actually an independent inspectorate from the EU come into Ireland to oversee what went on, because on the River Shannon there is a major issue with turbines where eels are basically destroyed in their tons. This has not been addressed. Water extraction companies, we have now evidence where the EPA have given licenses far exceeding what is an international norm. So it appears the fishing was took out to cover up for industrial and agricultural pollution. It can be only that. And speaking to scientists, what we come up again is that eels are on the critically endangered list. The fishery has to be closed, but it hasn't been closed in Holland. It hasn't been closed in Northern Ireland. They manage their fishery, but the term fishery science gymnastics in Ireland came up, and basically it appears that our scientists make the EU directives and these fit their agenda, and their agenda was to close down these fisheries. They didn't actually speak to the people. They didn't see the alternatives of it. Like in Holland, the eel fishery, not only is there a fishery, but it's centred around major sustainable tourism, festivals, seafood, and it's a lovely experience in Holland, the whole eel thing. That was in Ireland. In Waterford, we had the oldest man-made structure going back thousands of years, the fishware, and this centred on the eel fishery. All this cultural heritage will be lost, and the best we can get from these people is recorded. But it's not recorded because all of the traditional knowledge, you could say, in Ireland with regards to fisheries is all handed down father to son. So there's a complete cultural heritage being lost. And the interesting thing also in the fisheries, as the fisheries have diminished and have been squeezed down, the more we see different fishery talks we have BIM, we have IFI, we have the Marine Institute, we have the SFPA. We have so many people now in office jobs compared to where we had active fishermen 40 years ago. The term like more chiefs than Indians is very relevant to the fishery. And like we often get this thing again, scientific advice. Like the scientific advice in Ireland has to be taken with a major pinch of salt. Like the salmon fishery is closed on foot of, again, scientific advice, but there is no scientific counters on the river. There is a system used where they say it's a scientific model, but it's very biased because it depends on anglers recording their catches. Now, I'd be very friendly with a lot of anglers and they tell you straight they don't record it because why would they be putting down fish that would help their, as they see their arch enemy?
Do you think there's a potential opposition has been created between anglers and?
Yes, that has been encouraged, I believe, by the formation of IFI. Prior to IFI, we had the regional board.
What's IFI? Inland Fisheries
Ireland.
Yeah.
Before IFI, we had the regional board. They may have had a lot of shortcomings, but at least the local people had some way of having advice. So now where we have the board of IFI has no representative whatsoever of commercial people, of their heritage. Even the enforcement officers, and a lot of them are very fine people, like they most of them come from the angling community, because like the angling community has for years campaigned to ban traditional fisheries who were there far earlier in existence than they were, but it seems you can go 60% beyond the directive to shut down something by 100%. Now, I don't think that would be allowed in any other sector. It definitely wouldn't happen in agriculture. It would not happen anywhere else, And I think like the fact like that IFI is not representative of it and can't be spoken to was really the my resulted in my decision to go back to fish.
You mentioned there chiefs and Indians.
Yeah.
You seem to have a great interest in
I would have
Native American culture. You've often mentioned it before.
I would have since I was a child. I would have had an interest in it, particularly like in their relationship with the earth, with actually fishing, and their whole view on life on this planet and trying to live in harmony and sustainability. And there's a great man who lived called Billy Frank. And I believe every fishery manager, fishery enforcer needs to study the life of Billy Frank Jr. He was a Muscogee Indian. In 1964, they were basically where we have been for the last 20 years. Their rights were taken away. They were being dragged away from the river, and they made a decision after all the lobbying had failed to go back. And their mantra was back to the river, and they went back to the river. 8 men, small number of women and children went back, and they were beaten, they were arrested and imprisoned, and they went back to the river the next day. The women went back and the children went back, and the same happened, and that resulted in Marlon Brando was the first to recognise what was going on. And it resulted in tear gassing and all sorts of jailing and all that. But they got a decision in the American court that recognised them, and they got their rights back. Now, I think unfortunately we're in that position here today, because I think by talking to these people, we're never going to get our rights back, because they are our rights. Like our licences were handed down father to son. One of the things they done in recent years was when you die, your licence is gone. That's ethnic cleansing. That doesn't happen with a farm. It doesn't happen with anybody else. So, like...
How has this impacted the local community here in Cheek Point?
Well, when the salmon fishery was forced, you must remember they first closed the salmon fishery. A couple of years later they closed the eel fishery. They were all done on this scientific advice. At the time of the salmon fishery, it was well reported, these communities don't have anything else. We're in an estuary, we haven't vast resources miles offshore. What we have is what we always had. And like it has been reported in the press, it's there on the record, like there's been terrible tragedies in this estuary. It's there on the record, the reasons for it, and the reasons was in fishery management. If you take a fishery away from people who have small boats up in an estuary and you force them out to go to sea and all that in boats like that, this is what happens, and that's what happened unfortunately with the case in Passage East with the Bulger brothers. Those people's rights were denied them, the right to just go out and fish like they always did. And like,
what happened to the Bulger brothers? Sorry.
There was a tragedy there about 7 years ago where 3 brothers from the one family lost their lives lobster fishing. Those would have been traditional, experienced men in the estuary. Their boat was suitable for the estuary, but there was no mechanism for them to make a living. And again, like the excuse, it was on scientific evidence it had to close. It didn't have to close. The fishery in this estuary and all other estuaries for generations has fluctuated. There's been wild fluctuations and there's been great years and there's been desperately bad years. And there's a natural law among fishermen that every fisherman understands, but no scientist seems to understand it, that when things are very scarce, it's not worth going at it. And that leaves the stock, a chance to recover. So, like, these people are saying there's not enough there. Like, there was men fished in these rivers. People mightn't believe it, but it's there on the record. And it happened, like, for 12 or 13 salmon for 5 or 6 months of the year. That's all they got. Fish were so bad. They emigrated because the fish were not there. Yet in 63, the rivers filled up with salmon and all this. So, the traditional knowledge, the records of the fishing was never considered. It was the science taking an a la carte view on the evidence. Their evidence to suit their agenda. And like the one thing that has come home to roost now is that this vision of Ireland being an angler's paradise is not going to ever happen. Angling as a sport is in decline. It has been for many years. Young people have computers, they have cars, they have this. It is a beautiful sport for people, but it's a very tiny thing. And even people now in the industry will tell you that a lot of angling shops have closed because they were basically just a showcase for people to go in and have a look at the equipment and buy online. So the opportunity that's been missed in this country for 20 years is for these amazing heritages. Like, you have the west coast of Ireland, you had men fishing in currachs up to 20 years ago, salmon on the Shannon. How iconic a product that could be, a wild Atlantic salmon caught in a thing that was probably 10,000 years old going back. The same here on the shore, like we had prongs and punts, we had fish with. Anybody who couldn't market it should be in market, in my opinion. And this is where, like, the Dutch have their eel festivals and they have everything centred about their living heritage in a sustainable, managed way. And like, when they removed the fishermen, it gave free rein for industry to pollute, because the eyes and ears, like, we had an issue here for the last nearly 10 years where we were reporting that the mussels were dying, they were disappearing. The first we were told, no, you're wrong, didn't happen. We had evidence there, videos that were taken. Then there might be an issue. Then we can't find a smoking gun. And now apparently that there was very, very lax licensing. Now, I ask you, there's a handful of men left in this estuary that's fishing. And you have officers in jeeps, drones, cameras, binoculars, and nobody saw this, and yet everybody in the villages saw it. You go down to Dunmore East, you have the SFPA, big major building. This has happened a few miles away. It's on the local paper, people are saying it, and nobody wants to know. But if it was a fisherman goes out and he doesn't have a bit of tonnage on his boat, or something, there's plenty of law for him. So, like, going back to the Muscogee Indian thing, I think the fishermen have a decision to make. If we're going to accept this, we're gone. We're finished. Or if you stand up and fight, you have a chance. And I think if people, like, appreciate that, like, in Ireland there's different cultures. There's a travelling culture, there's a farming culture, there's fishing culture. It's a beautiful thing to have a culture. If you leave it die, it's gone. But it's always something to go back to. So if it's for what fighting for, people should fight for it. And I would at this stage, I'd advocate that people, that the IFI, sorry, they either re-engage with people and have a review of their policies, or that a new government would abolish them, because they are a biased organisation. They do not give us advice. The permanent government is a big problem. There's a lot of good people in the IFI who will acknowledge that we are getting screwed. You go up across the border, there's an eel fishery. You go to Holland, there's an eel fishery. There's an eel fishery in Germany. So, I believe myself that is blatant discrimination. I would not want. What good is it to the like of us saying we want to fish out salmon? There's nothing else, so we want to do it. That don't make sense. But we want to fish. We want to fish our traditional ways that proved before we were born that they were sustainable. What's not sustainable is the agricultural grants that drained every meandering stream and turned them into miles of a canal. Companies with free rein to pollute, the like of the ESB with the turbines on the Shannon. It all needs to needs to be reviewed. And IFI in Ireland have control over 3 former commercial fisheries: the bass fishery, the salmon fishery, and the eel fishery. Every one of them is closed. Now, when you speak to scientific people from abroad, they say, well, that's failure. If you were a doctor and your 3 patients were dead, you weren't a good doctor. And it's very simple. It's not that the fisheries are the state they are, they're rigging it. Now, the bass will say at the moment, I fish bass with my grandfather. There is more bass in the river today than was then when my grandfather was alive. Every angler in the country is allowed, I don't know, is it 1 or 2 bass a day during the bass season. But nobody knows how many anglers there is. Nobody knows how many bass there is. So how can you say they're endangered? If you look at the evidence in France and the pictures, like the French fishermen, in the trawlers getting the big shots of bass, there's tons and tons and tons of bass. And they're on the southeast coast, the south coast of Ireland, bass in abundance, and in England. A line caught bass fishery in England typically runs by, you go in and you have your dinner, you order a bass. There's a little tag, and you go www line caught bass fishery. It tells you a little history of the bass fishery, the fisherman that done it, his boat, very feel good thing, and how sustainable it is and how it is approved as sustainable. And a person like that is into sustainable living, can say, well, look, this is how to do it. But in Ireland, no. In Ireland, import bass that's reared in a swamp down south of Europe somewhere, and our own bass is being caught off the coast of Ireland and being brought to France. So a review, I believe anyway, a review of the whole fishery policy thing, because at the moment fisheries seems to be where you go if your family hadn't just smart enough to become a doctor or something. And was another thing was identified with the Native American people. Not until they got their sons and daughters into the professions, the marine biologists, the managers, that they started seeing justice. Because if you come from another sector, would say you come from farming background or Dublin 4 background, you look at fishermen, you don't look at how they look at things. It's very easy for you then to be judgmental and bring in policies and say, look, they're a bit backward, there's an old way of life and all that is gone. But it's not gone, because it's too valuable to be gone. It's particularly now with this coronavirus, it shows how food security is important to a country. You go out there and you catch your own bit of food, your own bit of fish and all this, and you have a bit to spare. That's how the people lived in these villages. That's why it's very, very similar to the Native Americans. Here it would have been a subsistence commercial fishery crisscross. A lot of people, they just made enough to live and a little bit to sell. And the old people got a bit of fish and they were looked after. It was very, very, very similarity. Even funny enough, there'd be some of the words that's used over there, particularly in Newfoundland, that would have originated from here, would be the very same as we would talk. So I believe I go back to fish anyway. They will probably try and talk me out of it. They'll come down and probably take the gear. Probably tell me to lobby TDs, but I think we're kind of gone past that.
So you're saying if they don't give you the right to grant you a license to fish, you're going to go fishing anyway?
Well, I'm not trying to bully. I'm trying to open a line of discussion where we can see that banning something is not the only way. Like we need to focus their minds on it, because their minds is focused purely on cleaning us out or killing us off. I need to focus their minds on there has to be another way. People have the right to live, I believe anyway, and particularly like I see my own belief on it is that if you go around the coast of Ireland and the rivers of Ireland, you will find family names going back in the 1700s still in the same place being prosecuted for poaching. And them families are still there today, and probably going back 1,000 years to where they're. So I believe they would have a fair claim to say they'd be kind of semi-indigenous people to that area. Now, those people have lived there for centuries, and their people is there, and they're bound to the land. Like as Billy Frank said, we're not going anywhere. There's nowhere for us to go anymore. Like we know industry in this estuary is building up around us, but they're still able to manage in Rotterdam, where fishing can cohabit inside in a commercial harbour, like, you know. So like it's not like about getting, because that's the way it feels. And like it's not just me. A couple of years ago, well, it's more than a couple of years ago now, the former Monsignor of Finnigtown, Dingle, and in fair dues to him, he called it right. He said the whole lot of them, Department of Marine, EU, the lot, they should be harangued before an international court on human rights on a lesser charge of ethnic cleansing. And that's how it feels. And like these people might think that's emotive language, but if you don't give a man an opportunity to live, what do you turn him into? I think it was Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela said, like, if you don't give a man the opportunity to live his life as he needs to, like, he has no other option but to become an outlaw. And like, I'm not saying I'm an outlaw, but I'm definitely not going to lie down, because I think, like, you know, that's the problem. There's too many people lying down. And like the whole picture of Ireland and its fisheries, if you look at it, we all say, oh, we got a wicked bad deal in 1974. We didn't get a wicked bad deal in 1974. We got robbed in 1974. But if you look at it a bit deeper, there's been so much corruption in this country. Was there corruption involved? How could a nation sign away something so valuable for the rest of people's lives, for generations unborn, and say that goes on? Why can we not have a review of all fishery policy for the betterment of this nation, not for a few big companies that seems to be the EU? Because if we keep going the way we are, not only in fishing but in agriculture and more so too, there's a lot of farmers now are getting sick of the EU. Farmers have sold their single farm payments it frees them up to go and farm as they see. So I believe the tide is turning on the farmers' love affair with the EU. But like, we have a vast natural asset in the fishing, but at the moment it's been centralised on few big businesses, big operators who own the quota. The rest is dying out, but the majority of the people are the people that's dying out, and it all needs to be reviewed for the betterment of the country. Like, if you go, how do
you think Ireland's entry into the European Union has affected fishing?
I think it has decimated. I don't think it. I can see it. It has decimated fishing, and I think that people don't realise how it decimated communities. The fishing would be worth far more, I believe, in the long run than the agricultural grants. Now, farming needed to develop, but I think had farming, like if you talk to farmers, experienced farmers who were farming when we joined the EEC, apparently the prices were better then than they are now, and their way of life was better. They could make a living. A big farm was 70 acres. They could make a good living from it, and they weren't up to their neck in debt. So the bigger it's a race to the bottom. What's going on? And like, go back to the fishing thing. It all needs to be reviewed, and I think, like, it's again in Ireland's history, somebody else's difficulties is our opportunity. But I don't think. I hope we take it, because like, with the problem now in the EEC with Brexit, and now is the time for Irish fishermen and agriculture as well. And I believe, like, there should be a rural group in there, or even I'd go as far, there should be a rural party that should get together and say, right, let's get this idea out there of getting out of Europe, because we will scare them. Because they've tried to screw the turf cutters, they've screwed the fishermen for years, now they're screwing the farmers. And if we don't stand up, we'll have a few big operators. They reckon, like in Ireland, the plan was about 4 marts in Ireland would have been suffice if you compare it to Australia. But we're not Australia, we're Ireland. And this is the thing that these people don't understand what Ireland is about. There's a disengagement there, and like, you know, when you've done as long as I did, going to different parties, asking about the same thing, and you're told it is an EU directive. You go to the EU and they tell them it's the Irish interpreter. It is all designed just to frustrate to get you to go away. And the only way is to try and focus their minds on something, because otherwise, it's not going to change.
Hasn't there been a lot of funding given to relief, like for fishermen who've been disenfranchised?
There has been payments, pittance of payments. How can you compensate somebody like for you know, you close down a fishery and you offer people a small bit of money for it as a once-off payment. But like, if you have major landowners in this country, big business billionaires like Larry Goodman, I don't know, they're getting 300,000 or 400,000 a year from the EC. That spread that out among fishermen would be very thin on the ground. I think it's a way like funding is a great thing when it's used properly, but it seems to be as a kind of a part of appeasement. It's very same as with the Native Americans offering them shiny beads, them chasing their tails. You know, like what we had was far more valuable in the fisheries, and what we've lost was far more valuable. And like, when you talk about reports, have we ever seen a report that would have shown the people what Ireland as a nation would have been like had it kept its fishing rights? I'd like to see that report, because I believe farming would have benefited, because if you had 1,000 people working in Dunmore East in a fish factory, they'd be going up having 1,000 dinners. They'd be going up eating their beef, their fish, their vegetables. The farmer would gain. Like a typical, I've seen it in the salmon campaign in this country, fighting for the salmon rights. You've seen programmes there where they put up an example of a fishing hotel in the west of Ireland. Well, typically it is owned by a foreigner who's employing non-nationals on a minimum rate, and he's talking about, oh, we must ban fishing. I'm talking about salmon traditional fishing that went on for hundreds of years. Why should he ban traditional fishing in my country and tell me that a fish that I catch is worth less than his? Like, this is another excuse that we've been used for years. A fish caught on a rod is worth 1,000. A fish caught by a fisherman is worth 100. That fisherman has a right to live just the same as any man. Fairness doesn't come into it. They are actually putting a value on one man's life more than another, you know. And this is the thing. And I think, you know, the like of Social Justice Ireland and, you know, the Equality Commission need to start looking at fisheries, what's going on. Because what will happen, I believe, is when you disenfranchise a whole community, which has happened like in Aboriginal communities in Australia, New Zealand and North America, when you disenfranchise them and take them away from their roots, it can have far-reaching and not foresee and far impacts. You know, I mean, if you have young men grow up with their grandfather doing something that suddenly becomes illegal, when their grandfather is gone, how does that feel? That, you know, and this is what I think is happening in these villages. The villages are dying, and the young people are going away, and those that are left, you have all the social issues that have resulted from anything being taken from people.
Sean, why don't you learn how to code computers and go and live in Dublin City?
I wouldn't want nothing to do with it. Lee, you see, they can't understand the quality of life we had. There was a man sat here, and I spoke to him the day before he died. Brian McDermott, he went into a coma, and he said, his last words to me was, the last comment, he said, you keep fighting. He said, right, you keep fighting for the fishing. He said, which he was. He said, I was going to go back to fish. He died this time of year in March. I was going to go back to fish that summer, he said, but I didn't get the chance. And I have daughters who were going to go with him, and there was other young people here who were going to go out and do what I'm going to do this year. He was going to go out salmon fishing, and his idea was that to go out and show like that he was fighting back, because he wasn't getting. You know, he didn't get the opportunity to do it, and he came home from London in 1960s, and he said that he went out to fish with my grandfather, and he said his life was never the same. He said it was just like a drug. He said it was so lovely. He could come in here, he said, everybody's door was, the key was in the door. He could call into anyone for a cup of tea. He said the whole thing, you needed nothing else. You needed nothing else. He said everything was there for you. And like, I got a taste of that. I'd be a lot younger, but I saw what it was and what it was like to have a village and a community. And the funny thing was that there weren't half as many grants. There was no grants or nothing. Things were just natural, you know. And like, we've losing the sense of community. They're destroying community. I don't know, is that what they want? Because like, if you don't have a strong community, you have nothing. You know, that's what pulls people through. Pulled people through during the war. We have no famine graves in Chick Point passages. Very few famine graves, because we had the fishing. We had the fishing during the famine. Now they took it off us. You know, there was a court case a few years ago, and they were talking about the fishery board and all that. And a man said they're worse than the black and tans. Cromwell didn't do that. Now, that's how people feel about it. Now, one big failing the fishermen have, and unfortunately, I suppose it's by design, to get a coherent way of putting the point across. Because if you look back on the history of fisheries since 1974, a lot of people have come to the fore in the fishing industry, and out of protests and that, and a lot of them are picked off by the establishment. And they start off on this side of the table, but by the time they finish, they're over here. Now, what happened with myself, I was offered a position one time. Actually, what was said to me was, he said, look, he says, you're on the outside pissing in. He said, you need to be on the inside pissing out. And I was offered a kind of a positions on different things. And the fishing mean too much to me to be going around chasing a few pound at expenses at meetings and all that. If I could go to him and fight my corner and have me position, but I wouldn't be prepared to turn coat and start talking about other stuff that would be against what I want. Like, my heart is with the people that I knew growing up in this village who lived over it. I was lucky enough to grow up in the house my grandfather was in until 90 years. He was 90 years of age when he died. I know the stories. There was a salmon war here in the 1800s when they came down and cut down the salmon weirs. There was a war fought here down on the strand, and like, there was my great grandmother said, when there's a dirty man in Chick Point, there'll be always salmon caught on this shore. That's down where my people come from. And like, it's not that we didn't have hardships before in people's lives, like, but I think today people are they're so conditioned by scientific advice, by this and that they're not looking through it. I'm sure if you went back to penal times, the scientific advice would have been, you can't go in and pick sticks, or you can't do that. Scientific advice is a tool, but it can be used against it. And I think that's what's happening. We need independent scientific advice. We need sustainable science. We need science we have trust in. I believe if you had a referendum, a fisherman tomorrow morning, 99% would say, well, let's get out of Europe. I believe if you had a referendum on farming 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 99% would have said, we'll stay. But I think if you had it today, I think 25% of them would be fairly sick of it. You know, so things are changing. They're not listening. And if you keep lying down, they're not going to give you what it is to live. You know, we all hear of we have full employment. Who believes that in this country? Half the country's on schemes and all this, make work schemes as they call them in Newfoundland a few years ago. You know, the whole thing is an illusion that thing is going great and we're all dancing around a big mulberry tree or whatever they call it, singing "We Are the World." It ain't going to last. You know, if people don't regain some sovereignty in their own country and their own waters and their own land, a few big co-operators, and there was a man in England there, two quotes I make from England. One man said, one of these days you look up and be www.tesco.com, trawling up and down off the coast, they'll own Dakota. And Alan Dewan there, who's originally from Bunmahan, to give the man his due, he made a very, very interesting statement recently on a BBC programme where he said, if Britain and Ireland pull out of the EU, Europe doesn't have a fishing industry. They don't have the fish in the southern waters, you know what I mean? So like, just imagine if Europe begging us for fish. So like, there has to be that. And the thing, I wouldn't like to come across for 1 minute anti-agriculture. I think like any culture, it's a beautiful culture. I think we're kind of getting trapped by this thing. Agriculture has now become an agri-business. I don't like that. We hear a lot about the suckler cow and all that. Anyone knows anything about cows? No, suckler cow is probably the most sustainable animal. She gets fed hay or silage. She have a calf once a year, grass fed and all that. It's the dairy industry actually that is the thing, is that's unsustainable levels. That it's been pushed the whole time. You need to put out fertilizer. You need to feed the cows meal, and this all then has an impact on the water quality. So like this vision of Ireland where you go down and you see a few lovely cattle on the green fields overlooking a lovely bay where there's a man out hauling a few lobster pots or a salmon net or something. That is what they're selling, but it's not what they're doing. It's not. And like I think also, like a thing be close to my heart is the role of the Catholic Church. In all the Irish boats that I know of in this part of the country anyway, they all carried blessed palm, a stub of a blessed candle and a bottle of holy water. They blessed the nets on a Monday morning. They got their boats blessed once a year. If the fishing was particularly bad, they got the priest down to bless the nets. And there was always a little bit of pride there that when our Lord picked his disciples, he picked the fishermen. He didn't pick enforcers or fishery scientists. He picked the humble fishermen, right? So there's always a sense of pride there. Even in the Scottish band, there's a great sense of pride that he picked them. Now,
why did he pick the fishermen?
He picked them, I believe, now from my little bit of research, but because of what they were. They were the same as they are today. They're hard to organise, and they're open-minded people, and that was one of the reasons why he picked them. And like a few years ago, the Pope had a International Fisherman's Day or something. But they need to stand up.
Of course, the first Pope was a fisherman.
St. Peter. They need to stand up and they need to say, look at, right, their heart's desire might be go back to fish, right? You can't grant that. I'll be the first to say I can't that. But they can say they want science that they can trust. They want fair play. They want representation on these boards. They don't want you picking someone who starts off on their side and turn them to your side. I mean, again, the example of Billy Frank Jr., Muscogee Indian, is the one that you should for. Go back to your heritage, go back to the water, because it is worth its weight in gold. Because like in a world where everything now is going so fast, I never ever heard any of the old fellas here saying they were depressed. Never ever saying they were bored. They never needed a man's shed. They were never short of a bit of crack. There was always a bit of crack. There was always a bit of banter. And like, I know people who came back from London here on holidays who were married into girls whose fathers would have been here, and they didn't want to go back. They thought this was amazing. The carry on, the crack here. And I mean, you'd often say, oh, Chick Pine, Passage East, there's full of poachers. Yes, there's full of poachers. There were poachers. Most of them are up in the graveyard. But there was always poaching. There was always salmon. Because like if you understood the tides, like the impact was minuscule on it. And this is the excuse. It's like telling the people, the Indians had to go off the land because they were holding up progress. But it was their land and they were happy on it. And like it's the same in these places. These people were here long before any of these Dublin 4 experts decided to wipe us out. But like again, going back to, these groups who say they represent people, like Social Justice Ireland, Equality Ireland, the Catholic Church, the Church of Ireland, any of them, they have to start saying, look, people are entitled to a fair hearing and a fair share. You can't. It's like it's like there a few years ago they said, the small family farm is no longer sustainable. They're all going to go. They didn't have to go. They don't need to go. If you had 50 acres of land in Ireland today and a part-time job, you're better off than a man in 150 acres and no part-time job. And you have a nice way of life. Come home, you have your few cattle, and you have a week's wages. So by saying they were uneconomical, it was perspective that they looked at. It's the same as what us and our fishing. We were very small scale fishing here, and it's minuscule. It doesn't register. But if you put it all together and you put like the well-being of the community, the health of the people, and all these things, it mounts up. So it's how you look at it. It's how you look at the whole thing. And like I think like that they need a bit of focus their minds on things to wake up. You know, I think people voted for change the last election, and I think that's what people want. And I think the one thing I'd like to see is that, you know, we get a debate on our exit. We're better off out. And even we don't get it, we'll scare them so much they'll give us a better deal. And I think eventually it'll collapse anyway. That'll be my thing. It's completely unsustainable. We'll get out of it, you know, because it has been very, very hard on anyone in this country who had a way of making a life from our national assets before we joined the fishermen, you know, the average family farm and all that. Like the prices were better and the freedoms were better and all these directives. I mean, I wasn't old enough to vote in them, but I never remember agreeing for Angela Merkel to tell me how I should live. You know, and that's how I feel about it. And I mean, it's the same as Irishmen have for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's our right to our own self-determination. If we haven't got the right to have a fair hearing, we're going to kick. And like, we've always been down in this country, but we've always rose up again. And like, I think that's what needs to happen. But we need to do it this time more smartly with these fisheries and all that. There's young people, graduates and all that, and we need to get the facts and figures, and we need to see what's going on, because it's been sold off for a reason, and the reason is like Europe, and there's big interest there, I believe, behind it all. You know, how can you come from a situation, say with the herring fishery, where you had hundreds and hundreds of boats employing thousands of men who had thousands more processing, barreling herring, smoking and all that, down to a situation where you have a handful of boats, everything is on a button, no employment. They come in the middle of the night. Like, it's grand if you own a heap of quota and all that, but where is it for the community? Like, where are we going? Because like, the next generation, if that quota is sold, the big company have it, it could be from any part of Europe, and then you're gone. You know, like even France, much of its quota now is owned by Spain. You know, its fishing industry is not as strong as what it was at all.